The attic smelled of dust and old paper, the kind of scent that clings to forgotten things. Sarah Mitchell had been sorting through her late grandmother's estate in Richmond, Virginia, for 3 days when she found the wooden box tucked behind a stack of moth-eaten quilts. Inside, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, was a photograph in a tarnished silver frame. She lifted it carefully into the dim light, filtering through the attic window. The image showed a wedding couple from another era. The woman in a high-necked lace dress with leg-of-mutton sleeves, the man in a dark suit with a stiff collar. They stood before a simple wooden house, their expressions serious in the formal style of early photography. The date, June 1911, was written in faded ink on the back. Sarah smiled, assuming these were distant relatives she'd never known. But something about the photo nagged at her. She pulled out her phone and took a picture, then zoomed in on the screen. Her breath caught. There, positioned deliberately to the right side of the couple, partially obscured by the bride's voluminous skirt, was a broom. Not an ordinary broom. This one was decorated with strips of colorful fabric tied around the handle, and even in the faded sepia tones, she could make out what looked like carved symbols on the wooden shaft. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she zoomed in further. The fabrics weren't random. They were carefully knotted in specific patterns. And those symbols on the handle, though worn and difficult to see clearly, appeared intentional, deliberate. She sat back on her heels, her mind racing. Her grandmother had never mentioned this photograph. In fact, her grandmother had rarely spoken about the family's history before the 1950s, always changing the subject when Sarah asked about their ancestors. Sarah carefully removed the photo from its frame and turned it over again. Besides the date, there was a single word written in the same faded ink: truth. The afternoon sun shifted, casting new shadows across the attic floor. Sarah looked at the photo again, at the couple's faces, at their careful positioning, at that decorated broom placed so deliberately in the frame. Something about this wedding wasn't what it appeared to be, and someone, long ago, had wanted that truth preserved, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right person to look closely enough to see it. 2 weeks later, Sarah sat across from Dr. James Harrison in his cluttered office at the Virginia Historical Society. Books lined every wall, and photographs from various eras covered his desk. He was a specialist in early 20th century American social history, and his eyes lit up when Sarah placed the photograph before him. 1911, you said? He adjusted his reading glasses and leaned closer. Beautiful example of early portrait photography. The composition is quite formal, typical of the era. The couple appears affluent. That dress would have been expensive, and the house behind them suggests... He stopped mid-sentence. His finger hovered over the right side of the image. Is that? He reached for a magnifying glass from his desk drawer and bent over the photograph. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he looked up at Sarah. His expression changed entirely. Where did you get this? My grandmother's attic. Why? What is it? Dr. Harrison sat back in his chair, still holding the magnifying glass. Do you know what a jumping broom ceremony is? Sarah shook her head. It's an African-American wedding tradition that dates back to slavery, he explained carefully. Enslaved people weren't allowed to legally marry, so they created their own ceremonies. Jumping over a broom together symbolized sweeping away the old life and beginning a new one. After emancipation, many black communities continued the tradition. He pointed to the decorated broom in the photo. These fabric strips, these patterns, they're consistent with that tradition. And these marks on the handle, they look like Adinkra symbols. West African. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. But the couple in the photo? They're white. Are they? Dr. Harrison looked at her intently. In 1911, Virginia, this state had some of the strictest anti-miscegenation laws in the country. The Racial Integrity Act wouldn't pass until 1924, but even before that, interracial marriage was effectively illegal and socially impossible. He turned the photo toward her. Look at the bride's face. Really look. The positioning of this broom isn't accidental. It's intentional. Someone wanted this documented. You're saying my ancestor was... I'm saying, Dr. Harrison interrupted gently, that this photograph may document something extraordinary and dangerous. If your ancestor had African heritage but appeared white, she could pass in white society. But including this broom in her wedding photo, he shook his head in wonder. That took remarkable courage. Dr. Harrison pulled out his laptop and opened several databases. We need to find out who these people were. Do you have any names? Any family records? Sarah retrieved a small notebook from her bag. My grandmother's maiden name was Eleanor Whitfield. I found some old documents. Her mother was Clara, born around 1910. But before that, everything just stops. No birth certificates, no records. That's not uncommon for people who were passing, Dr. Harrison said quietly. They often had to erase their past entirely. What about the date? June 1911? He typed rapidly, accessing historical newspaper archives and county records. Richmond, June 1911. Let's see what we can find. The search yielded hundreds of results. Birth announcements, society pages, business transactions. Dr. Harrison added filters, narrowing by wedding announcements and marriage licenses. Nothing in Richmond proper, he murmured, but that doesn't mean much. If this was a passing situation, they might have married in a different county or not registered at all. Sarah watched the screen, feeling increasingly frustrated. So, we might never know? Not necessarily. Dr. Harrison zoomed in on the photo again, this time focusing on the house in the background. Architecture can tell us a lot. This style, the porch columns, the window placement. It's common in rural Virginia from that period. And look here. He pointed to something barely visible in the background. Is that a church steeple? Sarah squinted. There, in the far distance, was indeed what looked like a white church steeple rising above the trees. Small town, rural setting, close to a church, Dr. Harrison said, making notes. That narrows it down. Virginia had hundreds of small communities in 1911, but not all of them had photographers capable of this quality of work. He pulled up another database. Professional photographers were relatively rare outside major cities. They traveled between towns, advertising in local papers. If we can identify the photographer, we can track where this was taken. For the next hour, they pored over records, cross-referencing photographer advertisements with small Virginia towns that had churches matching the architectural style. Finally, Dr. Harrison stopped scrolling. Ashland County, he said, 30 miles northwest of Richmond. There was a photographer named Robert Hayes who worked that circuit in 1910 and 1911. And look, there's a note in his obituary from 1945. He read aloud. Hayes was known for his sympathetic portraiture and his willingness to photograph all members of the community. Sarah leaned forward. All members? You think that means? I think, Dr. Harrison said, we need to go to Ashland County. Ashland County was smaller than Sarah expected, its main street lined with buildings that hadn't changed much since 1911. The county clerk's office occupied a brick building with tall windows, and inside, rows of leather-bound record books lined the shelves. The clerk, an elderly woman named Mrs. Peterson, looked at them skeptically when Dr. Harrison explained their search. 1911 marriage records? We keep everything, but... She gestured at the volumes. Not all marriages were recorded officially back then, especially if... She trailed off, glancing at Sarah, then at the photograph Dr. Harrison had placed on the counter. Especially if what? Sarah pressed. Mrs. Peterson sighed. If there was something irregular about the union, people found ways, had to, or they couldn't be together at all. She pulled down a heavy ledger marked 1910-1912 and opened it carefully. What names are you looking for? That's the problem, Dr. Harrison admitted. We don't have names, just this photo, dated June 1911, and we believe it was taken somewhere in this county. Mrs. Peterson pulled out her reading glasses and examined the photograph. Her expression shifted almost immediately. She looked up at Sarah, then back at the photo, then at Sarah again. You related to these people? We think so. My grandmother was Eleanor Whitfield. Her mother was born around 1910. Mrs. Peterson was quiet for a long moment. Then she closed the ledger she'd opened and reached for a different one, this one from a lower shelf. The leather was more worn, the pages more yellowed. This isn't the official record book, she said quietly. This is what we call the shadow registry. Marriages that happened but couldn't be properly recorded. Minister would note them here just in case, but they weren't legal documents. She opened it carefully and ran her finger down the page. June 1911. June. Here. Thomas Reed and Catherine Miller. Married June 18, 1911. Reverend Samuel Morris presiding. Witnesses, Mary Morris, John Blake. Dr. Harrison leaned in. No ceremony details? No location? Never specific locations in the shadow registry. Too dangerous if the wrong people found it. Mrs. Peterson looked at Sarah. The name Catherine Miller mean anything to you? Sarah shook her head, but something stirred in her memory. Wait, my grandmother mentioned once a great-aunt Catherine. She said Catherine went north before she was born. That was the common story, Mrs. Peterson said softly. When someone was passing, families would say they moved away, safer for everyone. Dr. Harrison found the church records in the county's historical archive the next morning. a collection of handwritten journals kept by Reverend Samuel Morris from 1905 to 1923. The pages were brittle and had to be handled with gloves, but they were remarkably detailed. Sarah sat beside him in the archive's reading room as he carefully turned each page. Most entries were mundane: baptisms, Sunday services, community gatherings. But then, in June 1911, they found it. June 18, 1911, performed marriage ceremony for Thomas Reed and Catherine Miller. May God protect their union and keep them safe in these difficult times. The broom was blessed and placed in their home as a reminder of her mother's love and sacrifice. Sarah's breath caught. Her mother's love and sacrifice. What does that mean? Dr. Harrison continued reading. There's more. Catherine's mother, Ruth, came to me in tears 3 weeks ago. She is dying and wishes to see her daughter married before she passes. Catherine has chosen to live as she must, but Ruth wanted her to remember who she is, where she comes from. I agreed to include the tradition in the photograph, though Thomas understood the risk. They are brave beyond measure. Sarah felt tears prickling her eyes. Ruth. That was my great-great-grandmother's name. I remember seeing it on an old family Bible, but there was no other information. Dr. Harrison turned more pages carefully. Here, 2 months later, Ruth Miller passed August 3, 1911. She died knowing Catherine was married and safe. I conducted a private service. Only 5 attended. Catherine could not come, too dangerous now that she lives in town as Mrs. Reed. I think of her often, living between 2 worlds, belonging fully to neither. They sat in silence for a moment. The archive's fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and outside, traffic passed on the modern street. But in this room, they were connected to 1911, to a dying woman who wanted her daughter to remember her roots, to a reverend who risked his position to honor that wish. Do the journals mention anything else? Sarah asked. About Catherine or Thomas? Dr. Harrison continued scanning. In November 1911, Thomas and Catherine have left Ashland County. They told neighbors they were moving to Richmond for Thomas's work. I pray they find peace. Catherine left me a note thanking me and asking me to watch over her mother's grave. I will. Then, in 1913, received letter from Catherine. She has a daughter. She named her Eleanor. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. That's my great-grandmother, Eleanor. The Richmond City Directory from 1912 listed a Thomas Reed clerk residing at 412 Elm Street. Dr. Harrison and Sarah stood outside the address 3 days later. The building was gone, replaced by a parking garage in the 1970s, but the neighboring structures gave them a sense of the area. Working-class neighborhood, Dr. Harrison observed. Mixed community in those days. Immigrants, laborers, some black families in adjacent streets. The segregation wasn't as rigid in certain neighborhoods, especially in poorer areas where everyone struggled together. They visited the main library next, requesting census records. The 1920 census showed Thomas Reed, his wife Catherine, and daughter Eleanor, age 7. Under race, Catherine and Eleanor were marked W for white. That's what passing looked like on paper, Dr. Harrison explained. Census takers went by appearance. If Catherine looked white and lived as white, that's what got recorded. But Sarah noticed something else. Look at the occupation. Thomas is listed as a clerk, but Catherine has no occupation listed. Why? Women's work often wasn't counted unless they were employed outside the home. But also, he pointed to a note in the margin, barely legible. Home teacher. What's that? Could be many things. Some women who were passing taught their children at home to avoid too many questions at school. Or, he paused, thinking, or she might have been teaching other children in the community informally, passing the knowledge on? Sarah's phone buzzed. It was an email from a genealogy website she'd subscribed to after their discovery. Someone had responded to her query about Catherine Miller Reed. Dr. Harrison, look at this. She showed him the screen. The email was from a woman named Patricia Johnson in Philadelphia. My grandmother told me stories about her Aunt Catherine who married a white man and moved away. We lost touch with that side of the family in the 1920s. Is this the same Catherine? Dr. Harrison smiled. That's how history comes back to life, one thread at a time. That evening, Sarah called Patricia. The woman's voice was warm, slightly hesitant. I never thought I'd hear about Aunt Catherine again. My grandmother, Catherine's niece, used to say Catherine made an impossible choice. What choice? To live as white, to protect her daughter. But she never forgot who she was. My grandmother said Catherine would send letters sometimes with no return address and money when the family needed it. She'd sign them, "Your sister always." Dr. Harrison arranged for the photograph to be professionally analyzed at the university's conservation lab. Under specialized lighting and magnification, details invisible to the naked eye began to emerge. The lead conservator, Dr. Lisa Chen, pointed to the fabric strips on the broom. These are silk ribbons, expensive for 1911. 3 colors: blue, yellow, and white. In some African American wedding traditions, colors had meanings: blue for love, yellow for prosperity, white for purity. She zoomed in further on the digital scan. And look at these symbols carved into the broom handle. They're definitely Adinkra. This one here is Sankofa. It means, go back and fetch it. Return to your roots. Sarah felt goosebumps rise on her arms. She was sending a message. The whole photo is a message. Absolutely, Dr. Chen agreed. And there's more. See how the couple is positioned? Catherine's hand is resting on Thomas's arm, but look at her other hand. It's behind her back, and her fingers are positioned oddly. She enhanced that section of the image. Catherine's hidden hand was making a gesture, fingers arranged deliberately. It could be random, Dr. Chen admitted, but it looks like she might be signing something. Sign language existed in 1911, and some communities used hand signals to communicate secretly. Dr. Harrison leaned in. Can we find out what it means? Over the next hour, they compared Catherine's hand position to historical references for hand signals and early sign language. Finally, they found a match in a book about coded communication among Underground Railroad operatives and freed communities. It's not standard sign language, Dr. Harrison said quietly. It's older, a signal that meant remember or don't forget. It was used when people had to separate, as a promise to keep their connection alive. Sarah looked at the photograph with new eyes. Every element was deliberate. The broom with its colored ribbons and Sankofa symbol, Catherine's hidden hand signal, the formal pose that seemed conventional but concealed so much. She knew, Sarah whispered. She knew that someday someone would look closely enough to understand. She was leaving a map, Dr. Harrison said, not to a place, but to the truth, for her descendants, for you. Sarah touched the glass covering the photograph gently. Across 113 years, her ancestor was speaking to her, ensuring that even if Catherine had to hide who she was in life, the truth would survive in this single image. What do we do now? Dr. Harrison smiled. We find out the rest of the story. The Richmond Historical Society's newspaper archives revealed more than Sarah had expected. In 1923, a small article appeared in the back pages. Thomas Reed, 45, clerk at Morrison & Sons, passed away suddenly, survived by wife Catherine and daughter Eleanor, 10. He died young, Sarah said softly, only 45. Dr. Harrison continued searching. They found Thomas's death certificate, cause of death listed as heart failure, but there was a note from the attending physician about long-standing stress-related illness. Living with that secret, protecting his family, the constant vigilance, Dr. Harrison said. It took a toll. After Thomas's death, the trail became harder to follow. The 1930 census showed Catherine Reed, widowed, still at the Elm Street address with Eleanor, now 17. But Catherine's occupation had changed. Laundress. She lost economic status after Thomas died, Dr. Harrison observed, a widow alone, having to support herself and her daughter. Sarah found a record of Eleanor's high school graduation in 1931. No father listed at the ceremony, but Catherine was there. The school newspaper described Eleanor as an exceptional student planning to attend normal school to become a teacher. But there was no record of Eleanor attending normal school. Instead, in 1932, there was a marriage license, Eleanor Reed to William Whitfield. My great-grandfather, Sarah confirmed, he was white, from the established Richmond family. Dr. Harrison found William Whitfield's family information. Comfortable middle-class background. His father owned a hardware store. This marriage would have elevated Eleanor's social position considerably. And continued the passing, Sarah said. My great-grandmother married into a white family, and nobody knew. They found Catherine again in the 1940 census, living alone, occupation listed as none, residing in a small apartment in a different part of Richmond. She was separated from her daughter, Sarah realized. Eleanor was living in a white neighborhood with her white husband. Catherine couldn't be part of that life. A death certificate from 1947 revealed the end of Catherine's story. Catherine Miller Reed, age 58, died of pneumonia. The informant was listed as neighbor, not her daughter, not family. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. She died alone. My great-grandmother couldn't even attend her mother's funeral, could she? Probably not safely. Dr. Harrison said gently, not without raising questions. But then he found one more document, a property record from 1946 showing Catherine purchasing a burial plot, and next to her name, in small print, prepaid arrangements for E. Whitfield Reed. She bought a plot for her mother, Dr. Harrison said. Ruth. She made sure her mother had a proper burial place, even if she couldn't visit openly. Sarah stood at the cemetery gates with Dr. Harrison and Patricia Johnson, who had flown in from Philadelphia. The old section of the cemetery was overgrown, headstones weathered by decades of rain and sun. They found Ruth Miller's grave first, a simple stone, the inscription nearly worn away. Ruth Miller, 1869 to 1911, beloved mother. 20 feet away, they found Catherine's. Catherine Reed, 1889 to 1947. Patricia knelt down, clearing away leaves and debris. My grandmother always wondered what happened to Catherine. She used to cry when she talked about her, about how Catherine had to choose. It wasn't really a choice, Sarah said quietly. Not when the alternative was poverty, discrimination, danger. She was trying to protect her daughter. Dr. Harrison had brought the wedding photograph, now safely preserved in archival plastic. He held it up, and in the afternoon light, Catherine's face seemed to come alive. Young, hopeful, determined. She left us this, Sarah said. This one piece of truth. Everything else she had to hide, but this she preserved. Patricia wiped her eyes. My grandmother said Catherine used to write letters. Short ones, never saying much, but always ending with, "Remember who you are." I never understood what she meant. The Sankofa symbol, Dr. Harrison said, pointing to the carved broom in the photograph. Go back and fetch it. She was telling everyone to remember their roots, even if they couldn't acknowledge them publicly. Sarah had brought something with her, a small broom she'd made, decorated with blue, yellow, and white ribbons, just like the one in the photograph. She placed it carefully at the base of Catherine's headstone. For you, she whispered, and for Ruth. You didn't forget, and now we won't either. As they stood there, an elderly black woman approached slowly, leaning on a cane. She looked at the three of them, then at the graves, then at the photograph Dr. Harrison still held. Is that Catherine Reed's wedding picture? She asked, her voice soft but clear. They turned, surprised. Yes, Sarah said. Did you know her? The woman smiled sadly. My grandmother was Mary Morris. She was the witness at that wedding. She told me the story before she died. Said Catherine was the bravest woman she ever knew, living with one foot in two different worlds, never quite belonging to either but making a life anyway. She looked at Sarah directly. You her granddaughter? Great-great-granddaughter. The woman nodded. She'd be glad you found her. She worried, my grandmother said. Worried that one day there'd be nobody left who knew the truth. That Eleanor's children and their children would grow up not knowing where they came from. She reached out and touched the photograph gently. But you found her. That's what matters. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the Virginia Historical Society, watching as visitors examined the new exhibition. Hidden Histories, African American Heritage and the Practice of Passing in Early 20th Century Virginia. Catherine and Thomas's wedding photograph was the centerpiece, accompanied by all the documentation they'd uncovered. Reverend Morris's journal entries, census records, the shadow registry, family letters that Patricia had contributed from her grandmother's collection. But it wasn't just Catherine's story. Dr. Harrison had found 6 other families with similar histories, all in Virginia, all from the same era. The exhibition honored all of them, people who'd had to hide their heritage to survive, but who'd left small clues, tiny acts of resistance, messages for the future. Patricia stood beside Sarah, along with 3 other descendants they'd found through genealogy sites and DNA testing. It turned out Catherine's family was larger than anyone had known. Cousins and second cousins scattered across the country, many of whom had no idea they had African American heritage. Eleanor's story had been uncovered too. Sarah's grandmother, now 92, had finally shared what she'd known but never spoken about. Eleanor had told her the truth shortly before she died, sworn her to secrecy, but left her the wedding photograph as insurance that the truth wouldn't be completely lost. She was ashamed, Sarah's grandmother had said, tears in her eyes. Ashamed that she'd lived as white, ashamed that she'd let her mother die alone. But she was also terrified. Terrified of what would happen if people knew, of what it would mean for her children. Now those children, Sarah's grandmother and her siblings, could finally stop carrying that secret. The exhibition didn't judge Catherine or Eleanor or any of the others. It simply told the truth, that racial categories were artificial constructs, that people had done what they needed to do to survive, and that their stories deserved to be known. A school group gathered around the photograph, and Sarah listened as the museum educator explained the significance of the broom, the Sankofa symbol, the hidden hand gesture. "Why did she hide her hand like that?" a young girl asked. "Because she wanted to leave a message," the educator explained. "A message that said, 'Remember who you are, no matter what you have to do to survive.'" She knew she couldn't live openly as herself, but she found a way to preserve the truth. Sarah thought about Catherine, about the weight she'd carried for 58 years, about Ruth, who died knowing her daughter would have to hide her heritage, about Eleanor, who'd lived her whole life split between two identities, about all the small, quiet acts of courage it had taken to preserve this one photograph. The broom in the image seemed to glow under the exhibition lights. Those bright ribbons, those carved symbols, that impossible object that shouldn't have been in a white wedding photo but was there anyway, a small act of defiance frozen in silver and light. Catherine's face looked out from 1911 with determination and grace, and Sarah understood now what her ancestor had known, that truth has weight, that heritage matters, that even when you can't live openly, you can leave a map for those who come after. The jumping broom tradition had survived slavery, segregation, and decades of forced silence. And now, 113 years later, it had brought a family back together, across racial lines that had once seemed impossible to cross. Sarah placed her hand on the glass case protecting the photograph. "We remember," she whispered. "We remember now."